The jobs that South Africa needs tomorrow will not look exactly like the jobs it has today. Let me explain. Artificial intelligence, automation, new industries are changing what employers need and how companies compete and how economies grow. And this raises obviously a very difficult question. Is higher education moving quickly enough? Here in South Africa, the stakes, I don't need to tell you, are particularly high. The higher education debate goes to the heart of growth, to productivity, and also to economic participation. This is No Ordinary Wednesday, an Investec podcast where we examine the forces shaping business, markets, and economies. I'm Jeremy Maggs. And today we're asking what higher education means in this age, in this era of rapid change. It's all about future readiness, what students need, what employers value, and what South Africa has to get right if education is to become a stronger bridge into the economy. It's an important issue. And to discuss this, I'm joined by Jerome September, Dean of Student Affairs at Wits University, which, by the way, was recently ranked number 1 in Africa in the 2026 Center for World University Rankings. That is a timely signal of the role that African universities play in developing talent for this changing world. And from Investec, Lesley-Anne Gatter, Global Head of People and Organization. So to both of you, a very warm welcome to No Ordinary Wednesday. And Jerome, let me start with you and this big shift that I referenced in the introduction. When universities think about preparing students for the future, what do you think has changed fundamentally over the past 5 years?
Well, of course, good morning and thank you for having me. Of course, 5 years ago, exactly 5 years ago, we were in the middle of COVID and we thought of a different reality coming out of COVID. And part of that was many people were telling us at the time, the idea of in-person campus experience is a thing of the past. Now we know that it's not quite as simple as that. And so I think the big shift has been AI and the impact of AI, the digital world, and how we now think about the kind of graduates that we send into the world, the kind of citizens that we produce for a world that is really uncertain to some extent, scary for some of us. But how do we now help young people navigate this complex world where tomorrow is not quite so certain as we may have thought a couple of years ago?
And Lesley-Anne, that is so apt and so pertinent because it is scary and it is uncertain. From an economic perspective, why does this matter now? When we talk about, for instance, South Africa's low growth challenge, how directly do you think that is linked to the quality, the relevance, and the accessibility of education right now?
So we think education does matter. And I think that as the world progresses, and as you say, and as Jerome has said, that uncertainty prevails, that the only thing we can be sure of here is that AI will shape the workforce of the future. It will shape economic participation as things go, and automation will govern. So what does that mean? Does technical skills matter? Does the growth in the economy, does the participation, increase with education? And we think it does. We think education is the bridge between potential and participation in this economy. And the real angle is, what will people get educated in now? Where do they go? We think technical skills matter, but we really do think that the big game changer, the step move to participation is the how, what we do now, and how it gets absorbed.
Jerome, that's so important, the how trumping the what. Obviously, both are important, but there's this trope, the future of work. And you'll agree with me that it becomes quite abstract at times. From where you sit, for a student entering university today, what does that mean practically, do you think?
Well, it can be very abstract, you are right. But I think for us, what it means at a practical level is that the degree is no longer the full package, right? That degree is a foundation. And what we've got to do is to help our students on a journey towards learning sets of skills, behaviors, values that makes them not just think about a job tomorrow, but to think in a broader sense about economic participation. And so for the first year student, it is to help them think about how they use this time at a university, which is really a special time, 3-4 years in the educational process, to think about that as a lifelong process, that I'm going to constantly need to upskill, unlearn, relearn, find new ways of being, of doing, and so on. And to think also about how they use this time at at university to prepare themselves for that world. So to what extent do they get involved in what is often referred to as the co-curricular space, the extracurricular space? So the clubs, the societies, the vibrancy that sits there, the crossing the cultural lines, the meeting people outside of your comfort zones. And think also in how they present themselves in the online space, right? So how do I think about a future me and kind of build the ways of being towards that future me?
And just for the record, you're not necessarily talking about nightclubs, are you?
Well, that could be fun too, but it is then about that balance, right? So how do I live life?
Yes.
How am I this young person that necessarily must push boundaries because that's the phase of life that I'm in? But how do I do it in a responsible way so that when Lesley-Anne looks at my online profile in a few years' time when I want a job at Investec, that I'm not super embarrassed about some of the things.
You're making me very nostalgic for the past, Jerome. Lesley-Anne, let me come back to you. Let's leave nightclubs, shall we? When you look at companies and sectors right now, what are employers starting to value perhaps more highly in the present than they did, say, a decade ago? There has been a paradigm shift.
The big shift that we've seen is that as the machines become so much more present in our world and as they absorb huge parts of technical capability and the automation happens, really the shift is to human capabilities. It's never been more important in the employer environment to look at human capability. So as the machines become, more capable, we want humans who are more humane. We want humans who really amplify human capabilities. And I think Jerome spoke about it, about that cross-leverage, that crossability. So we're interested in people who can solve complex problems. We're interested in people who show great resilience. We're interested in people who have high adaptability and can really be agile in what's shifting. Because in that uncertainty, we don't quite know what's going to shift and be. You can't predict the shift entirely, and it's moving so fast, but we absolutely want the application more than the technical capability. Knowledge is a commodity now, but the human capability very well may not be.
So deep breath, everyone. Let's go to artificial intelligence, shall we, Jerome? It's already changing how students learn, how academics teach, and how employers, I guess, are starting to assess talent. So how are universities, I wonder, responding without resisting technology on the one hand, but also adopting it uncritically? And I think uncritically is the key word.
So AI is here. Our students are using it every single day. And we as university, we've got to embrace that. And we've got to move beyond the point of fear and embrace AI fully. But as Lesley-Anne says, what are the skills that students are now taught to ask the deeper questions? So do I simply accept what I'm given by ChatGPT, or do I critically analyze? Do I look deeper? What sort of questions do I ask? The prompts that I put in that perhaps gives me a certain answer. And so how do we teach our young people around those things? The second thing, and we do this with the first year class during orientation already, right? Part of it is then this idea of academic integrity. So to what extent am I using the AI in an ethical way, in a way that upholds our values, the integrity, and so on? So do I acknowledge that this is someone else's work? And how do I acknowledge that? And then it's about the human skills, the critical thinking, the resilience, the deeper questioning, the analyzing. And in many respects, philosophy is probably now more important than ever before, because it's the philosophers that teach us about critical thinking. It's the philosophers that push us our brains to think beyond here and now and to imagine possibilities. And so that's what we're having to do with our students, is to really from day one, we embrace. It does mean in teaching practice, it's about the process of learning. It's about the love of learning and how we help students on that journey to learn, to love learn, to push the boundaries, to think wider. And so for the PhD, for example, we are now thinking about the oral exam, right? So you've got this fantastic PhD that you've written, the thesis, but let's have a conversation about this work so that we can now critically analyze to what extent is this actually fully your ideas.
I love the line about philosophers. It's so important. More Plato, less perplexity, I think is what you say. Lesley-Anne, from a market and company perspective, how is AI then changing the way in which businesses are starting to think about talent?
So the big link, and I think Jerome has spoken to it, is that we're looking for people. We are thinking of our talent that is shown and has kind of evidentiary track record of people who can think in ethical ways, people who have made those kind of ethical decisions, people who ultimately have shown that they don't engage in this cognitive surrender. We're interested in talent that has embraced the AI, works with it, but knows how to work with the application. We're interested in people who don't replicate what's there, but who apply ethics, who apply resilience, who apply thinking. One of the most interesting quotes, I think, the talent of the future can learn, unlearn, learn again, unlearn, and learn again. And it ties into the philosophy piece. As much as we as all employers are rolling out huge AI learning pieces throughout our organizations, and our L&D departments are just frenetic with AI learning, actually we'd be better off teaching a class in philosophy. We'd be better off teaching critical reasoning, ethical thinking.
Folks, hold all of those thoughts. We're going to continue this conversation in just a moment. We're going to look at education investment, capital allocation, and what South Africa should watch out for as the world of work, as you've been hearing, is changing and changing rapidly. First, a quick reminder to follow Investec Focus Radio SA wherever you get your podcasts or on YouTube. A new episode of No Ordinary Wednesday is released every fortnight, bringing you clear conversations on the trends shaping business, markets, and the economy. Now let's get back to this fascinating conversation. Lesley-Anne, let's pick up on education investment. When investors think about infrastructure, they often think of energy, ports, roads, maybe digital networks. Maybe we should be thinking about education in the same way. What's your thinking?
I think you're right. I think education is the infrastructure to opportunity. Education lays the bridge to really accessing opportunity. And if it is that bridge between potential and participation, we need talent that is vibrant, that is resilient, that is capable of being all the stuff we've discussed around being really human, but it equally needs to know how to work with knowledge. It needs to understand what to do. So education becomes the fundamental place that we see knowledge being built, but application being developed. We think that universities will play the role that they've always played, but the role that they were originally intended to place, noble places of learning that question the canon, that question the AI, that work beyond the hallucination that's coming in automation.
So, Jerome, talking about noble places of learning, and it's such a beautiful phrase. How do you think universities then should balance two expectations? One is producing graduates who can enter the labor market, but also, as you've also both alluded to, producing citizens who can think ethically, critically, and independently.
They're not competing priorities. I think they are integrated. And so if I look at Wits, one of our values is around excellence. And so it's this commitment to excellence that says, I don't accept just what is in front of me. Part of that is a deep questioning. It's a commitment to pushing boundaries. It's a commitment to ethical behavior. It's a commitment to, as we say, to working for good. And it's not for my personal good. Yes, of course, for my personal good, but for the good of the society and the good of the community that I find myself in, which is exactly the kinds of skills we need as a citizen that doesn't just accept things at face value, but are also committed to creating that kind of ideal society of the future. And here we go back to why it's then important for students at universities to get involved in the co-curricular activities, because it is in the leadership position, it is on the sports field, it is in the debating society, it's in the residence that some of those boundaries are pushed. And so it's that emotional intelligence, it is the critical thinking, it is the pushing of boundaries, but this unquestioning commitment to excellence, which I think as a society we need so deeply.
So what you're saying is that there is a risk that future skills conversation becomes too narrow if it is simply focused on immediate employability.
Absolutely. If we only think about the immediate employability, we're probably positioning ourselves out of relevance. It's got to be about economic participation. It's got to be about skill sets that I could use in different environments. And so as I think about my work of the future, it's perhaps not that it's a job at Investec that I arrive in as a 23-year-old and retire as a 60-year-old, but it's perhaps different things that I do across the journey of my life. Some things, perhaps selling my skills to different organizations at the same time. But importantly, what also needs to come into the conversation is entrepreneurship. And so the graduate not only thinking of themselves as a job seeker, but as a job creator. And it is within that entrepreneurship development kind of skills that it is about problem solving, thinking about what are the needs of society and how I solve those kinds of problems. And so it's economic participation, the skills that's required to live a dignified life, which is what we all want, and then the ways of being where I don't only think of myself as looking for a job, but perhaps seeing a problem and creating a solution and thereby creating jobs for others.
And Lesley-Anne, in that respect, organizations, Investec included, have a responsibility. And Investec's education work spans initiatives such as pro-maths bursaries, Invest-Ed. We've spoken about these before on this podcast. Without turning this into a program discussion, what do you think the broader principle behind investing in learners should be before they reach the workplace?
I think we can't overestimate investing in learners before they reach the workplace. The principle, I think, is very clear. Talent is far more evenly distributed than opportunity, actually. And what we need to do is invest in that talent pipeline long before it gets to the workplace. I actually think South Africa has done pretty well in this, and Investec, I hope, champions how we think about this. But corporate South Africa has long invested in universities and specifically in learnerships programs, chairs, institutes inside the universities. We've long seen that we have to come in at that level of university and high school, in a pro-maths example, but in university to really amplify the talent pipeline that comes into the university. Given how uneven education is in this country, I think we need to really hype up what happens inside universities and places of higher learning, because we need to really enhance that talent pipeline long before it gets here, even if it's not going to work here, even if it's going to do things like bounty work, external opportunities, entrepreneurship.
Do you have any sense, Lesley-Anne, which sectors in South Africa are most exposed to this future skills question that we've been talking about?
Financial services, healthcare, advanced manufacturing, the green economy. These sectors and spaces are changing rapidly. But I would say that less focus on the sectors, actually, and more focus on the capabilities. Because as Jerome said earlier, coming in with a skill, just being technically appraised is not going to help anybody, the sector or the individual in time. Really, the capabilities that we're going to need, which are transferable across sectors, are going to be where we're interested in unlocking potential. It's the ability around continuous learning that is going to be the capability.
Jerome, if universities then are expected to prepare students for this more complex world that you alluded to at the start of this conversation, what support or policy certainty do you think is needed?
I think in the first instance, there's probably conversations that needs to be had about a more adaptive regulatory framework. I mean, at the moment, it is really difficult for a university to change course content. And so there's got to be a conversation around how some of that is made easier so that universities can perhaps move faster with the times around certain aspects of those. Sitting in that, of course, is then also this idea of universities thinking and investing in lifelong learning, which means that we've got to think about micro-credentialing. We've got to think about those short courses that are able to respond to the immediate needs that there might be. So while the degree is still relevant in terms of preparing you for that longer term and laying that kind of foundation, there's the immediate skills that are needed and the upgrading of those skills that's kind of required. Then, of course, there's the partnership. So industry, government, university working closer together. And lastly, I wouldn't be a dean of student affairs if I don't constantly make this point about the investing in the co-curricular and extracurricular space so that child can get into the debating union, which is where they're going to learn to reason, to argue, to think deeper. That's also an important component.
And what is the biggest risk, Jerome, if higher education doesn't adapt quickly enough?
Well, it's the disconnect. there's already question marks across the world around the relevance of universities. And many young people in a context where I think our graduate unemployment rate is currently around 12%. And so many ask the questions about the relevance of a university education in this context. And so the university has to adapt, but the university also has to go again back to where we started, deep within itself, to stay perhaps true to its roots. And its roots, has always been about more than the technical skill. It has been about developing a citizen, a full human being who can think, who can reason, and own sets of values and ways of being.
And Lesley-Anne, last question then, from an economic perspective, what do you think the risk is if South Africa fails to close this future skills gap that we've been talking about?
If South Africa fails to close the gap, I think there's an economic cost, but there's a human cost. The exclusion will just create a widening divide that will be unparalleled almost just because the pace of change is so rapid at the moment. I do think more optimistically about it. I think that where other infrastructure and other step-up changes could leave countries like South Africa behind, because tech is so nascent, because the change is so rapid, I think the world's all in a very similar place, actually. So access becomes a very big piece, but we could leapfrog big gaps at the moment, given that we could all be on a very similar place. It could be very similar for South Africa as it could be for, so-called more advanced or more inclusive economies. We could really move very fast, but the cost is an economic imperative. It's a societal one.
And that's where we are going to leave it. Jerome September, Dean of Student Affairs at Wits University, Lesley-Anne Gatter, Investec Global Head of People and Organisation. Thank you both for joining us on this edition of No Ordinary Wednesday. Just a quick reminder, a new episode of No Ordinary Wednesday drops every fortnight. To ensure that you don't miss out, search for Investec Focus Radio SA wherever you get your podcasts, and all you need to do is hit the follow button. Until next time, goodbye from me, Jeremy Maggs, and the entire Focus Radio team.
The views expressed are those of the contributors at the time of publication and do not necessarily represent the views of the firm and should not be taken as advice or recommendations. Investec Limited and subsidiaries, authorized financial service providers, registered credit providers, and long-term insurer.